The morning sun cast long shadows across Norfolk's financial district as I adjusted my press badge. Another day, another story to chase. But this one felt different, more personal somehow. Corporate fraud cases targeting women had been piling up on my desk, each file a testament to lives derailed by deception. "Ms. Walker, the editor wants these interviews done by Friday," my assistant called out as I gathered my survey materials. I nodded, though my mind was already racing through the questions I'd prepared. As a journalist for 12 years, I'd learned that the real stories often hide in the spaces between prepared questions. The street was bustling with the usual morning crowd, suits and heels clicking against concrete in their rushed dance to office buildings. I positioned myself near the entrance of Winchester Tower, clipboard in hand. My brown hair kept falling into my face despite my attempts to tuck it behind my ears, and I wished I'd worn it up today. "Excuse me, would you be willing to participate in a survey about workplace experiences?" I repeated this phrase countless times, watching most people hurry past with apologetic smiles or blank stares. The responses I did get were frustratingly superficial, carefully worded to avoid saying anything too revealing. Then she appeared. She moved with purpose, blonde hair catching the sunlight. But unlike the others, she actually stopped when I spoke. Her blue eyes met mine, and for a moment, I forgot my rehearsed introduction. "A survey? About workplace experiences?" She tilted her head slightly, curiosity evident in her expression. "I might have quite a bit to say about that." "I'm Sarah Walker from the Norfolk Daily," I said, trying to maintain my professional demeanor despite feeling oddly flustered. "We're investigating patterns of corporate discrimination and fraud." "Valerie Torres," she responded, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "And you've just found yourself someone who knows this topic intimately." We moved to a nearby coffee shop, away from the rush of the street. As Valerie spoke, I found myself hanging on every word. She described her experiences with remarkable clarity, each detail adding depth to the story I'd been pursuing for weeks. "It's like a perfectly orchestrated dance," she explained, stirring her untouched coffee. "They make you feel valued, irreplaceable even, right until the moment they take everything." I scribbled notes frantically, but part of me was more focused on the way her hands moved as she spoke, the slight tremor in her voice when she touched on particularly painful memories. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that made me want to know more than just the facts for my article. "Would you be willing to go on record with this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your perspective could help others recognize the warning signs." Valerie paused, considering. "On one condition," she said finally. "You let me read the article before it goes to print. Not to change anything, just. I need to be prepared for the response." I agreed immediately, even though it was against my usual policy. As we exchanged contact information, our fingers brushed briefly, and I felt that same odd flutter in my chest I'd experienced when we first met. Walking back to the office later, my notebook full of detailed notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story was going to be different. Not just because of the content, but because of the woman who had trusted me with her truth. Little did I know then that this was just the beginning of a story that would change both our lives in ways I never could have imagined. As I sat down at my desk to begin writing, Valerie's words echoed in my mind, and I realized I was already looking forward to our next meeting, even if I wasn't quite ready to admit why. Over the next few weeks, my article about corporate fraud evolved into something much more complex than I'd initially envisioned. Valerie's story became my primary focus, not just professionally, but in ways that began to blur the lines between journalism and personal interest. I found myself scheduling follow-up interviews at a cozy coffee shop tucked away from the bustling financial district. The place had become our unofficial meeting spot, with its worn leather chairs and jazz music playing softly in the background. Each time we met, our conversations would start with the article, but inevitably drift into more personal territory. "You know, Sarah," Valerie said one evening, as steam rose from her untouched cappuccino, "I've never told anyone the full story before." The setting sun through the window cast a golden glow across her features, making her blue eyes appear almost luminous. "There's something about you that makes me feel safe." I tried to maintain my professional composure, but my heart was racing. "Sometimes the right listener makes all the difference," I replied, attempting to hide behind my reporter's notebook. She reached across the table and gently lowered my notebook. "Can we talk off the record for a moment?" I nodded, setting my pen down. The atmosphere shifted subtly, becoming more intimate despite the public setting. Valerie began sharing details about her life beyond the fraud case, her childhood dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. I found myself reciprocating, telling her about my own journey into journalism and the stories that had shaped my career. Hours passed without either of us noticing. The barista had to politely remind us they were closing soon. As we stood outside the coffee shop, the streetlights casting a soft glow around us, Valerie suddenly turned to face me. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice slightly nervous. "Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not for the article, just dinner?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with unspoken implications. My heart seemed to skip several beats before finding its rhythm again. "I'd like that," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. She stepped closer, and for a moment I thought, but then a group of late-night office workers passed by, breaking the spell. We quickly said our goodbyes, but not before her hand brushed against mine, sending electricity through my entire body. Back in my apartment that night, I stared at my article draft on the computer screen. The cursor blinked accusingly as I tried to maintain objectivity while writing about someone who was becoming increasingly important to me. Personally, the ethical implications weighed heavily on my mind, but I couldn't deny the connection we shared. The next morning, my editor called me into his office. "This story is good, Sarah," he said, waving my preliminary draft. "But I need more. Get deeper into her personal experience. What was she feeling during all this? What kept her going?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, suddenly protective of Valerie's privacy. "She's already shared more than most sources would," I argued. "And that's why this could be a breakthrough piece," he countered. "Don't lose your edge now, Walker. You're a journalist first." Those words followed me throughout the day. Yes, I was a journalist first, but something about this situation felt different. That evening, as I reviewed my notes, my phone lit up with a text from Valerie. "Thank you for listening today. It means more than you know." I stared at those words for a long time, my finger hovering over the reply button. The line between professional and personal was becoming increasingly blurry, and I wasn't sure I wanted to redraw it. Finally, I typed back, "Thank you for trusting me." As I set my phone down, I realized I was entering dangerous territory, but something about the risk felt worth it, even if I wasn't ready to admit why. The story that had started as a simple investigation into corporate fraud was becoming something else entirely, something that made my heart race every time I thought about our next meeting. My article about corporate fraud hit the front page of the Norfolk Daily's Sunday edition, and the response was immediate. My inbox flooded with messages from other victims sharing similar experiences, but my mind kept drifting back to Valerie. Her story had become the heart of the piece, though I'd been careful to maintain her privacy while sharing the essential truth of her experience. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "My apartment, 8 p.m. We need to talk about the article." My stomach tightened. Despite her previous approval of the final draft, I worried she might have changed her mind after seeing it in print. I arrived at her downtown apartment building exactly at 8, smoothing my hair nervously before knocking. Valerie opened the door wearing casual clothes, a stark contrast to her usual corporate attire. The sight of her in simple jeans and a sweater made my heart skip. "Come in," she said, her voice warm. "I have wine." Her apartment reflected her personality, perfectly elegant but comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. Stacks of paperwork covered her dining table, evidence of late-night work sessions. "The article," she began, handing me a glass of red wine. "It's perfect, Sarah. You captured everything without sensationalizing it, but that's not why I asked you here." She sat close to me on the couch, our knees almost touching. "I've been thinking about how to thank you properly for giving me a voice." "It's my job," I said weakly, though we both knew it had become much more than that. "Is this your job too?" she asked softly, taking my wine glass and setting it aside. Her fingers brushed against mine, and this time, neither of us pulled away. What happened next felt like a dream. The city lights twinkled behind us as we finally acknowledged the tension that had been building for weeks. Her touch was gentle, tentative at first, then more certain. Time seemed to stop as we explored this new dimension of our relationship, the night air thick with unspoken words and delayed desires. Later, as we lay tangled in each other's arms on her couch, the reality of our situation began to sink in. "This complicates things," I murmured against her shoulder. "Things were already complicated," she replied, running her fingers through my hair. "We just stopped pretending they weren't." The following days were a blur of secret meetings and stolen moments. During the day, I continued following up on leads from other fraud victims, building a larger exposé. At night, Valerie and I would meet to review my drafts, though we spent more time talking about everything else. "I never expected this," she admitted one evening as we worked late in my apartment. "When I agreed to that street survey, I was just trying to help other women avoid what happened to me. I never thought—" "I know," I said, understanding exactly what she meant. Our relationship had evolved from source and journalist to something neither of us had anticipated. My editor was thrilled with the growing scope of the story, but I struggled with guilt over not disclosing my personal involvement with my primary source. The journalist in me knew I should recuse myself from the story, but the thought of another reporter taking over Valerie's narrative felt wrong. "You're not compromising your integrity," Valerie assured me during one of our late-night discussions. "If anything, understanding my experience on a deeper level makes your reporting more authentic." I wanted to believe her, but the ethical implications kept me awake at night. The story was gaining traction, with other news outlets picking it up and expanding on my investigation. Each new development brought more attention, and with it, more pressure to maintain professional distance. As the month drew to a close, I found myself at a crossroads. The story that had brought us together was taking on a life of its own, but our relationship remained hidden in the shadows. Something would have to give eventually, but for now we existed in this delicate balance between public and private, professional and personal, each day bringing us closer to a reckoning neither of us was ready to face. The pressure started building slowly, like a pot of water approaching its boiling point. My editor, Tom, called me into his office early one Monday morning. His face lit with the kind of enthusiasm that always meant trouble for someone. "Sarah, the response to your corporate fraud series has been phenomenal," he said, shuffling through a stack of papers on his desk. "But we need more. Readers want to know what makes Valerie Torres tick. What drove her to rebuild after losing everything? We need the human angle." I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "She's already shared more than most sources would be comfortable with. That's not enough anymore." Tom leaned forward, his expression intense. "What about her personal life? Family background? Current relationships? These details make the story relatable." My stomach churned. "I promise to protect her privacy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She trusted me with her story. And she'll trust you with more. That's what you do best, Sarah. You get people to open up." He was right about that, just not in the way he imagined. "Get me something by Friday." Walking back to my desk, I felt the weight of my ethical dilemma growing heavier. How could I maintain journalistic integrity while protecting my relationship with Valerie? The story that had brought us together was now threatening to tear us apart. That evening, I met Valerie at her apartment, my mind racing with conflicted thoughts. She could tell something was wrong the moment she opened the door. "Rough day?" she asked, pulling me into a hug. The familiar scent of her perfume usually calmed me, but tonight it only intensified my anxiety. "Tom wants more personal details for the story," I confessed, sinking onto her couch. "He thinks readers need to know the real Valerie Torres." She sat beside me, her face thoughtful. "The real Valerie Torres?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "Which version? The successful executive they see now, or the broken woman who lost everything?" "You were never broken," I said softly, taking her hand. "You were wounded, but you healed stronger." Her eyes filled with tears as she began sharing memories she'd never told anyone before. The shame of realizing she'd been deceived. The nights spent staring at her ceiling, wondering how she'd missed the signs. The slow, painful process of rebuilding her life and career. "I wanted to die," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But something inside me refused to let them win." I held her as she cried, my heart breaking for both her past pain and our present predicament. When she finally looked up at me, her blue eyes were fierce despite the tears. "Write it," she said. "Write all of it." "But Sarah," she squeezed my hand. "Keep us out of it. This part belongs to us alone." That night, I stayed up late writing, pouring Valerie's story onto the page while carefully navigating around our relationship. Each word felt like a tightrope walk between truth and privacy, between professional obligation and personal loyalty. The next morning, I submitted the draft to Tom. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable. "It's good," he said finally. "But I know there's more you're not telling me." "Everything relevant to the story is there," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. He studied me for a long moment. "Just remember, Sarah, in this business, the truth always comes out eventually." His words followed me throughout the day, echoing in my mind like a warning. As I worked on follow-up interviews and fact-checking, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were approaching a crossroads. Sooner or later, something would have to give. That evening, Valerie called. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice tense. "Maybe we should take a step back until the story dies down." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. "Is that what you want?" "No," she answered quickly. "But I'm worried about your career, your reputation." "My reputation isn't worth losing you," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Come over, please." I didn't hesitate. Some stories, I was learning, matter more than headlines. Some truths are worth protecting, even if they never make it to print. The morning started like any other, with me rushing to the newsroom clutching my coffee. But everything changed when Tom called an emergency staff meeting. The conference room buzzed with speculation as we filed in, and I noticed several unfamiliar faces at the head of the table. "As you know, the Norfolk Daily is undergoing some changes," Tom began, his usual bravado somewhat muted. "I'm pleased to announce Sarah Walker's promotion to senior editor, effective immediately." The room erupted in congratulations, but I barely heard them. My mind was spinning. This promotion meant everything I'd worked toward for years. As my colleagues patted my back and offered their well wishes, Tom continued with the meeting. "And now, I'd like to introduce our new Chief Executive Officer," he said, gesturing toward the door. My heart stopped. There, in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, stood Valerie Torres. She walked in with the confidence of someone who owned the room, which, I realized with a jolt, she now did. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a professional twist, and her blue eyes swept the room before briefly meeting mine. If she was surprised to see me, she didn't show it. "Thank you all for the warm welcome," Valerie began, her voice steady and authoritative. "I'm looking forward to working with each of you to bring the Norfolk Daily into a new era." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything except the thundering of my heart and the overwhelming reality of our situation. The woman I'd been secretly seeing was now my boss's boss. After the meeting, I retreated to my office, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a message from Valerie. My office. 3 p.m. The hours crawled by. When I finally made my way to the executive floor, my palms were sweating. Her new office was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She stood at the window, her back to the door. "Close the door," she said without turning around. Once I did, she finally faced me. "I wanted to tell you." "When?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice neutral. "When you were sharing your deepest secrets with me, or when you were in my bed?" "It wasn't final until yesterday," she replied, her professional facade cracking slightly. "I've been in negotiations for weeks, but I couldn't say anything, not even to you." "So all this time, while I was writing about your story, you knew you'd be taking over the paper?" "The story had nothing to do with this position," she said firmly. "I earned this role based on my track record of turning around struggling media companies." I laughed bitterly. "And it didn't occur to you that sleeping with one of your future employees might be problematic?" "Of course it did," she snapped, then immediately softened her tone. "Sarah, what happened between us? It wasn't planned. You know that." We stood in tense silence, the city sprawling below us through the windows. Everything had changed in the span of a morning. The safe bubble we'd created for ourselves had burst, leaving us exposed to the harsh realities of professional consequences and office politics. "What happens now?" I finally asked. Valerie moved closer, close enough that I could smell her familiar perfume. "That depends on what we want to happen." "I just got promoted," I said, stating the obvious. "And I just became CEO. This could ruin both our careers if it gets out." She reached for my hand, then seemed to think better of it. "I know." The tension between us was palpable, filled with unspoken desires and professional obligations. We'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, created feelings that couldn't be unfelt. We need time, I said finally, to figure this out. She nodded, resuming her CEO posture. Take the rest of the day off, process this, we'll talk soon. As I walked back to my office, I could feel curious eyes following me. How long before people started connecting the dots? How long before our professional worlds and private lives collided completely? I gathered my things, my new senior editor nameplate catching the afternoon light. Everything I'd worked for was finally within reach, but the cost of keeping it might be losing the one person who made it all feel worthwhile. The whispers started slowly at first, a raised eyebrow here, a knowing look there. By the end of my first week as senior editor, the office was humming with speculation about my rapid promotion and its possible connection to our new CEO. Heard you knew Torres before she took over, said Linda from Features, trying to sound casual as we waited for coffee in the break room. Must be nice having friends in high places. I kept my face neutral, stirring my coffee longer than necessary. I interviewed her for the fraud story. That's all. But that wasn't all, and maintaining professional distance was becoming increasingly difficult, especially during editorial meetings, where Valerie's presence commanded attention. She'd wear these perfectly tailored suits that made her look every inch the CEO, but I couldn't help remembering how she looked in the soft morning light of my bedroom. One afternoon, I was reviewing layouts in my office when my computer pinged with an urgent meeting request. Valerie's office immediately. My heart raced as I took the elevator to the executive floor. Close the door, she said as I entered. The setting sun cast long shadows across her desk. We need to address the rumors. I've been trying to ignore them, I replied, remaining standing. Well, the board hasn't. She ran a hand through her blonde hair, a rare show of frustration. They're concerned about potential conflicts of interest. Are they wrong to be concerned? Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the professional facade cracked. No. We stood in charged silence until she moved around her desk, close enough that I could smell her perfume. I miss you, she whispered. The words hung between us like a dangerous promise. Before I could respond, her lips found mine, and suddenly we were making up for weeks of careful distance. Her hands tangled in my hair as she pressed me against her desk, professional boundaries crumbling like sandcastles in the tide. Later, straightening our clothes and trying to look presentable, reality crashed back in. This can't happen again, I said, even though we both knew it was a lie. The board is watching us closely, she agreed, fixing her lipstick. We need to be more careful. But being careful proved impossible. Every accidental touch in meetings, every lingering glance in the elevator fed the office gossip mill. My team started running stories by other editors, clearly uncertain about the chain of command when it came to me. The situation came to a head during a budget meeting. I was presenting my department's numbers when one of the board members, Jenkins, interrupted. Interesting how your department got such a generous allocation, Miss Walker. Any special reason for that? The implication in his tone was clear. Valerie straightened in her chair. Mr. Jenkins, if you have concerns about budget allocations, I suggest you raise them through proper channels. Oh, I think the channels being used are quite improper already, he muttered. The room fell silent. I felt my cheeks burn but forced myself to continue the presentation. Afterward, Valerie tried to catch my eye, but I hurried back to my office, locking the door. She found me there hours later, after most of the staff had gone home. We can't keep doing this, I said before she could speak. It's affecting both our credibilities. I know. She perched on the edge of my desk. But I can't seem to stay away from you. Maybe we should take a break, I suggested, the words feeling like glass in my throat. Give everyone time to forget the rumors. Is that what you want? No, I admitted. But I don't want to be the reason people doubt your leadership or my abilities. She reached for my hand, then seemed to think better of it. I built my career from nothing once before. I won't let anyone take this from me. Not even you. The words stung, even though I understood them. We'd both worked too hard to let everything fall apart now. But as I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors, I wondered if we were fighting a losing battle against our own hearts. That night, alone in my apartment, I stared at our old text messages, remembering simpler times when she was just a source and I was just a reporter. Now, everything was complicated by power dynamics and professional expectations. But despite all the reasons to end it, I couldn't bring myself to delete her number. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The board had called an emergency meeting, and I knew from the moment I walked into the conference room that something was wrong. Jenkins sat at the head of the table, his expression smug as he shuffled through a stack of papers. "Ms. Walker," he began. "We've been reviewing the timeline of your promotion and Ms. Torres's appointment as CEO." My stomach dropped. I could feel Valerie's tension from across the room, though she maintained her professional composure in her chair at the opposite end of the table. "The board has concerns about potential impropriety," Jenkins continued. "Specifically, the nature of your relationship with Ms. Torres prior to her appointment." "My promotion was based on merit," I said firmly, fighting to keep my voice steady. "My track record speaks for itself." "Does it?" Jenkins slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, Valerie and me leaving my apartment building, having dinner together, walking close in the park, all taken before her appointment as CEO, but damning nonetheless. "This is a violation of privacy," Valerie spoke up, her voice sharp with authority. "Whatever relationships existed before my appointment are irrelevant to current operations." "The shareholders might disagree," Jenkins replied smoothly, "especially given the recent budget allocations to Ms. Walker's department." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, I walked out of the meeting, through the newsroom, and into the pouring rain outside. I heard footsteps behind me, but didn't stop until I reached the small park across the street. "Sarah, wait!" Valerie called out, her blonde hair already soaked from the rain. "We need to talk about this." I turned to face her, rain streaming down my face. "Talk about what? How they're using our relationship to undermine both our positions? How everything we've worked for is falling apart?" "We can fight this," she insisted, moving closer. "I've faced worse opposition." "Have you? Because from where I'm standing, we're both about to lose everything we've worked for." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the pain in her eyes. "Is that what you think? That I'd let them take this from us?" "Maybe they already have." I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering in the rain. "Look at us, Valerie. We're sneaking around, hiding our feelings, letting them turn something beautiful into something shameful." She reached for me then, not caring who might see. Her hands cupped my face as rain poured down around us. "Nothing about this is shameful," she whispered fiercely. "Nothing about us is wrong." For a moment we stood there in the rain, foreheads touching, everything else falling away. Then reality crashed back in as another crack of thunder rolled overhead. "I'm thinking about transferring to the Boston office," I said quietly. "They have an opening for an investigative editor." Valerie stepped back as if I'd slapped her. "You're running away?" "I'm trying to save both our careers." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. "You've worked too hard to let this destroy everything. So you get to make this decision for both of us?" Her professional mask slipped completely, revealing the hurt underneath. "Without even discussing it with me?" "Sometimes loving someone means knowing when to let go," I said, the rain hiding my tears. She shook her head, water dripping from her hair. "That's bull, Sarah. That's fear talking, and you know it." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was afraid. Of losing her, of losing my career, of facing the judgments and whispers. But as we stood there in the rain, soaked to the bone and hearts breaking, I couldn't see another way forward. "I need time to think," I finally said. "Don't do anything rash," she pleaded. "Promise me that much." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I walked away, leaving her standing in the rain, I felt something inside me break. The rain continued to fall, washing away any traces of the tears on my face, but doing nothing to ease the ache in my heart. Back in my office, I pulled up the Boston job listing on my computer. The cursor blinked accusingly as I hovered over the application button, each flash a reminder of what I stood to lose, no matter what choice I made. The morning after our confrontation in the rain, Valerie did something unexpected. She called an all-staff meeting in the main conference room. I slipped in just as she began speaking, taking a spot near the back where I could watch without being too visible. "I've heard the whispers," she started, her voice steady and strong. "The speculation about how I got this position, about the decisions I've made since taking over. So let me be clear, I earned my place here through years of hard work and proven results." The room fell silent as she continued, "But more importantly, we need to address the culture of this workplace. The sideways glances, the subtle discrimination." The way we treat relationships between consenting adults as scandals rather than what they are, human connections. My heart pounded as I realized what she was doing. She was taking a stand, not just for us, but for everyone who'd ever felt judged or marginalized in the workplace. From this moment forward, the Norfolk Daily is implementing new policies regarding workplace relationships and professional conduct. What matters is ability, integrity, and results, nothing else. Jenkins, sitting in the front row, shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Torres, the board may have concerns about this direction. The board hired me to modernize this paper and improve our culture, she replied smoothly. That's exactly what I'm doing. Watching her command the room, I felt a surge of pride mixed with anxiety. She was risking everything we'd tried to protect by taking this stand. Later that day, I was working on an editorial about workplace discrimination when my computer pinged with a company-wide email. The new policies were detailed there, clear and comprehensive. But it was the final paragraph that caught my eye. The Norfolk Daily has always prided itself on uncovering truth. It's time we applied that same standard to ourselves. I couldn't focus after that. The words on my screen blurred as I thought about what Valerie had done. She hadn't just addressed the rumors, she'd challenged the entire system that made those rumors powerful. Around midnight, as I was finally finishing my editorial, a new email arrived. This one was just for me, my office, now. The newsroom was almost empty as I made my way to the executive floor. Valerie stood at her window, the city lights creating a halo around her silhouette. Your editorial, she said without turning around. I read the draft. How did you get access to that? I'm still CEO, she finally faced me. It's powerful, Sarah, especially the part about institutional bias masquerading as professional concern. I had good inspiration, I replied softly. She moved closer, her expression serious. I meant what I said in that meeting. I won't let anyone shame us for finding each other. But your position is secure, she interrupted. The board can't touch me without facing a discrimination lawsuit. Besides, our numbers are up since I took over. And what about my position? I asked. People will say I got it because of you. Let them talk, she said firmly. Your work speaks for itself. That editorial proves it. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling between us. Finally, I spoke. That was brave, what you did today. No, she shook her head. Brave would have been doing it sooner, before you felt you had to leave to protect us both. I haven't submitted the transfer application, I admitted. Relief flickered across her face. Good, because I have a better idea. How would you feel about heading up a new investigative unit? Complete editorial independence, focusing on workplace discrimination and corporate accountability? The offer took my breath away. It was everything I'd wanted professionally, without having to sacrifice what I'd found personally. Wouldn't that seem like favoritism? It would seem like recognizing talent and expertise, she corrected. The fact that I love you is separate from your qualifications for the position. The casual way she said love you made my heart skip. It was the first time either of us had used that word. We'd still face challenges, I warned. Of course we will, she agreed. But at least now we can face them together, in the open. Looking at her then, strong and determined in the late-night quiet of her office, I realized something. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't walking away to protect what you have. Sometimes it's standing your ground and fighting for what you believe in. The New York Times offer arrived on a Tuesday morning. The email sat in my inbox like a ticking time bomb, promising everything I'd ever dreamed of professionally. Senior investigative editor position, creative control, and a salary that made my eyes water. Before Valerie, I would have accepted immediately. Now, I sat staring at my screen, my finger hovering over the reply button as complicated emotions warred inside me. You haven't touched your coffee, Valerie observed from my office doorway. She developed a habit of bringing me my morning coffee, a small gesture that always made my heart flutter. The Times offered me a job, I said without preamble. Senior investigative editor. She set the coffee down carefully, her face unreadable. New York? Yes. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally she spoke. When do they need an answer? End of the week. She nodded slowly, moving to stand by my window. It's a fantastic opportunity. It is, I agreed, watching her carefully. But nothing, she interrupted, turning to face me. This is exactly the kind of opportunity you've worked for. You can't turn it down because of me. Can't I? I stood up, moving closer to her. What if I want to? Sarah. Her voice softened. I've been thinking about stepping down. That stopped me in my tracks. What? The board meetings, the constant scrutiny, the politics. It's not why I got into media. I wanted to tell stories that matter, to make a difference. She ran a hand through her blonde hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as her thinking pose. There's an offer from a smaller digital publication. They want me to lead their investigative journalism division. You'd give up being CEO? I'd give up the stress of constantly justifying my personal choices to a board of directors who care more about appearances than substance. I absorbed this information slowly. When were you going to tell me? I was waiting for the right moment. She smiled wryly. Seems like this is it. But you've worked so hard to get here. And I'll work just as hard somewhere else. She took my hands in hers. The question is, what do you want? I looked down at our intertwined fingers, thinking about the choice before me. New York represented everything I'd thought I wanted: prestige, recognition, professional advancement. But standing here with Valerie, I realized my priorities had shifted. I want to be where I can do meaningful work, I said slowly. Where I can tell stories that matter without compromising who I am or who I love. The Times would give you that platform. Maybe. I squeezed her hands. But at what cost? She studied my face for a long moment. You're really considering turning them down? I'm considering what matters most to me. I moved closer, resting my forehead against hers. And it's not a corner office in New York. Don't make this decision for me, she whispered. I'm making it for us both. I pulled back slightly to meet her eyes. Whatever comes next, I want us to face it together. She kissed me then, soft and sweet, a promise of things to come. When we separated, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. So what do we do now? She asked. Now, I said, reaching for my keyboard. I write a very polite email declining the Times offer. And then maybe we talk about this digital publication you mentioned. You're sure about this? I thought about the path that had led us here, from that first street survey to all the challenges we'd faced. Every step, every struggle, had brought us closer together. I've never been more sure of anything, I replied, hitting send on my response to New York. Some opportunities look perfect on paper, but the heart knows what it needs. Valerie smiled, that brilliant smile that still made my knees weak. Speaking of opportunities, want to hear more about this digital publication over dinner tonight? Is that a date, Miss Torres? That's a future, Miss Walker, if you want it. Looking at her then, I knew I'd made the right choice. Some decisions aren't about career moves or professional advancement. Sometimes they're about choosing the path that leads to the person who makes your heart feel at home. The envelope sat on my desk, bearing the prestigious logo of the National Journalism Awards. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, though I already knew what it contained. My series on corporate fraud and workplace discrimination had been nominated months ago. Congratulations, Sarah Walker, I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper. Winner of the Excellence in Investigative Journalism Award. I knew you'd win, Valerie's voice came from my doorway. She leaned against the frame, looking radiant in a navy suit that made her blue eyes sparkle. That series changed lives. Our story changed lives, I corrected, standing to embrace her. None of this would have existed without you. She pulled back slightly, her expression serious. The award ceremony is next week in Chicago. Are you ready for this? I knew what she meant. The ceremony would be our first major public appearance together since everything had changed. Since Valerie had transformed the Norfolk Daily's corporate culture, and I had declined the New York Times offer. Ready as I'll ever be, I replied, straightening my desk nameplate that read, Sarah Walker, Executive Editor, Investigative Division. The week flew by in a blur of preparations. Before I knew it, we were in Chicago, seated in an elegant ballroom filled with journalism's elite. Valerie's hand found mine under the table as the presenters began announcing the awards. And for excellence in investigative journalism, the presenter announced, the winner is Sarah Walker of the Norfolk Daily, for her groundbreaking series on corporate fraud and workplace discrimination. The applause was thunderous as I made my way to the stage. Looking out at the sea of faces, I saw Valerie beaming proudly, and suddenly knew exactly what I needed to say. This award represents more than just investigative journalism, I began. It represents the courage of every person who shared their story, who trusted me to tell their truth. But most importantly, it represents the power of transformation. I paused, meeting Valerie's eyes in the audience. Sometimes the biggest stories aren't just about exposing wrongdoing. They're about showing how we can do better, be better, how we can create workplaces and communities where everyone feels valued and respected. The response was immediate and overwhelming. As I returned to my seat, I could feel the energy in the room had shifted. Valerie squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening. Back at the Norfolk Daily, changes were already evident. Under Valerie's leadership, the paper had become a model for progressive workplace policies. Our readership had grown, especially among younger audiences who appreciated our commitment to transparency and equality. The board meeting went well, Valerie announced one evening, weeks after the awards ceremony. They've finally approved the expansion of your investigative unit. And what about the other thing? I asked, knowing she'd been pushing for more comprehensive workplace equality initiatives. Her smile was triumphant. Approved unanimously. Seems winning national awards has a way of changing minds. We celebrated that night, not just our professional victories, but how far we'd come personally. The whispers and sideways glances had largely disappeared, replaced by respect for what we'd accomplished together. Remember when you first interviewed me? Valerie asked, as we shared a quiet moment in her office overlooking the city. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? I thought back to that first meeting, the street survey that had changed everything. Not in my wildest dreams, I admitted, but I wouldn't change a thing. Not even the hard parts? Especially not those, I said, pulling her close. They led us here. Looking out at the city lights, I realized we'd done more than just win awards or change policies. We'd shown that love and integrity could coexist with professional success, that being true to yourself didn't mean sacrificing your ambitions. As if reading my thoughts, Valerie whispered, "We did it our way." We did, I agreed, knowing that our story was far from over. But whatever came next, we'd face it together, stronger for every challenge we'd overcome. 1 year later, I sat at my desk in the Norfolk Daily, putting the finishing touches on my latest investigative piece. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the award that still held pride of place on my shelf. But it wasn't the only thing that made me smile these days. Ready for the press conference? My assistant poked her head in, reminding me of the time. I nodded, gathering my notes. The Norfolk Daily had become a different place under Valerie's leadership, not just in policies and procedures, but in spirit. The nervous energy of the past had been replaced by something more authentic, more human. Making my way to the conference room, I couldn't help but remember how far we'd come. Valerie stood at the podium, commanding the room with her natural grace. She caught my eye and smiled briefly before beginning her announcement. Today marks a new chapter for the Norfolk Daily, she began. Our digital transformation initiative has exceeded all expectations, and our commitment to investigative journalism has earned us not just awards, but the trust of our community. I watched from the sidelines as she detailed our successes, increased readership, digital subscriptions up by 40%, and most importantly, a workplace culture that had become a model for other organizations. But perhaps our greatest achievement, she continued, has been proving that professional excellence and personal authenticity can coexist, that being true to yourself doesn't compromise your ability to lead or succeed. After the conference, we retreated to my office. That went well, I said, closing the door behind us. It did. Valerie perched on the edge of my desk. But I have one more announcement to make, just for you. She pulled out a small envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a key. Move in with me, she said simply. I'm tired of pretending we need separate addresses. I looked at the key, then at her. Are you sure? What about? About what? The board? They've seen our success. The staff? They respect us. The readers? They trust us. She took my hands in hers. We've earned the right to live our truth, Sarah. Standing there in my office, where our story had begun with a simple interview, I felt everything come full circle. We'd faced every challenge, weathered every storm, and emerged stronger. Yes, I said, pulling her close. Yes to moving in, yes to everything. Later that evening, as we walked home together through the Norfolk streets, I thought about that first day we met, how a simple street survey had led to this moment. "Penny for your thoughts?" Valerie asked, squeezing my hand. "Just thinking about how life surprises you," I replied, "how the best stories are often the ones you never see coming." She stopped walking, turning to face me under a streetlight. "Speaking of stories, I saw your latest draft, the piece about workplace transformation. And it's perfect. Just like you." As we continued our walk home, our home now, I realized that some stories don't need dramatic endings or grand gestures. Sometimes the perfect ending is simply finding where you belong, with someone who helps you be your best self. The Norfolk Daily would continue to evolve, and so would we. But we'd do it together, proving that love doesn't have to be hidden to be professional, and success doesn't have to come at the cost of authenticity. "Ready for our next chapter?" Valerie asked as we reached our front door. Looking at her in the soft evening light, I knew the answer with absolute certainty. "With you, always."